On the morning of May 6, 1983, the first pickup truck rolled onto County Road 48 in Lono County, Arkansas, kicking up a trail of pale dust that drifted across a rice field everyone had already stopped calling a rice field. The cracked earth stretched nearly 140 acres, broken into jagged plates by months of drought and years of exhausted soil. The irrigation levees had collapsed in places. The shallow canals were empty except for weeds and scattered turtle shells. Even the frogs had disappeared. 3 different crop consultants had visited during April, and every one of them left the same verdict written across a yellow legal pad: economically beyond recovery. The word spread faster than spring rain ever could. By the second week of May, farmers drinking coffee at Miller's feed store weren't asking whether Harold Bennett would save the field anymore. They were asking how long it would be before the bank took it. Harold heard every rumor. He simply kept tightening the same rusted gate each morning before sunrise. At 73 years old, Harold moved slower than he once had, but nothing about him suggested weakness. His hands looked like weathered oak bark, darkened by 50 years beneath Arkansas summers. The knuckles were swollen from repairing engines in freezing winters. His boots leaned slightly outward because he had walked thousands of miles along muddy rice levees instead of sidewalks. His face carried deep lines that only appeared on people who had spent entire lifetimes looking toward distant horizons instead of mirrors. He had farmed the same ground since 1956, when his father handed him a set of worn keys and said only 6 words: "Take care of it after I'm gone." Harold never forgot them. Neither did the land. His father, Thomas Bennett, had purchased the property in 1941 for $9,850, borrowing almost every dollar from a local bank that no longer existed. During World War II, neighbors helped harvest a crop, while young men served overseas. During the floods of 1957, the family rebuilt levees by hand using mule scrapers because there weren't enough tractors available. Through droughts, recession, fuel shortages, and falling rice prices, the Bennett farm survived because every generation believed the same simple truth: the land would remember how it had been treated. Most people thought that was just an old farmer saying. Harold believed it was biology. Let me tell you about Harold Bennett. He wasn't famous. He had never spoken at an agricultural conference. He had never appeared in a farming magazine. Yet almost every older farmer within 30 miles quietly admitted there were moments when Harold seemed to understand the soil better than the university experts did. He could crumble a handful of dirt between his fingers and tell whether irrigation had been delayed by 2 days or 5. He knew which corner of a field would ripen first, simply by watching how morning fog settled before sunrise. He listened more than he spoke, and because of that, people often mistook silence for ignorance. They always regretted it later. Parked beneath a faded tin equipment shed sat Harold's greatest companion, a 1968 John Deere 4020 diesel, purchased brand new in September 1968 from Greenway Equipment in Stuttgart, Arkansas for $8,940. Its 6-cylinder engine produced about 95 horsepower at the PTO and enough low-end torque to pull heavy discs through stubborn clay long after newer tractors began spinning their tires. The tractor weighed just over 8,800 pounds, and Harold knew every sound it made. He changed the oil every 100 hours, greased every fitting every Saturday, adjusted the valves himself every winter. The faded green paint had long since surrendered to the Arkansas sun, but the engine still started with the same confident rumble that echoed across the fields nearly every morning for 15 years. Harold never called it equipment. He called it dependable, because dependable things deserved respect. The trouble began during the unusually dry summer of 1982. Water levels across much of eastern Arkansas dropped lower than anyone had seen in decades. The rice crop struggled. Beneficial insects disappeared. Earthworms became scarce. The once soft soil hardened until irrigation water rushed across the surface instead of soaking downward. Fertilizer costs climbed nearly 20%, while yields continued falling. By harvest, Harold produced barely half the rice he normally expected. The numbers were brutal. Expenses climbed above income for the first time since the early 1960s. His daughter quietly suggested leasing the land. His son recommended selling 40 acres to pay debts. Even neighbors began saying the same thing. Maybe it's time. Harold never argued. He simply nodded, thanked him for caring, and walked back into his fields, because he wasn't finished listening yet. One cloudy afternoon in early May, a white county pickup rolled into the farmyard. The driver stepped out wearing polished boots that had never carried mud beyond a parking lot. His name was Daniel Mercer, 35 years old, recently hired by the County Agricultural Development Office after earning a graduate degree in agricultural economics from the University of Arkansas. Daniel believed in efficiency. He believed in modern science. Most of all, he believed that numbers never lied. He introduced himself politely before unfolding several printed soil reports across Harold's workbench. "I've reviewed every sample collected over the past 18 months, Daniel said. Organic matter has fallen below 2%. Nitrogen efficiency is collapsing. Your microbial activity is almost non-existent. Even with perfect weather, you're looking at losses." Harold studied the papers without saying a word. Finally, he folded them neatly and placed them beside an old coffee cup. "What would you do?" he asked. Daniel answered immediately. "I'd stop farming this field." Harold looked toward the empty rice ground shimmering beneath the afternoon sun. Then he smiled. "That's because you're trying to grow rice." Daniel frowned. What else would anyone grow in a rice field? Harold's answer was so quiet the wind nearly carried it away. "I'm not planning to grow rice first. I'm planning to bring the field back to life." "I'm not planning to grow rice first. I'm planning to bring the field back to life." Daniel stared at the old farmer for several long seconds. "The field doesn't need philosophy," he finally replied. "It needs productivity." Harold chuckled softly. "No," he said, "it needs balance." Daniel folded the reports and slipped them back into his leather case. Before climbing into his truck, he looked across the cracked field one last time. "I hope you're right, Mr. Bennett." Harold nodded. "So do I." The next morning, before sunrise, Harold climbed onto the faded seat of the John Deere 4020. The familiar diesel engine fired after only 2 revolutions, its steady rhythm echoing across the empty fields. The tractor pulled an old land-leveling blade that had belonged to Harold's father since 1952. Instead of preparing the ground for planting, Harold carefully rebuilt every levee, cleaned every water channel, and repaired every wooden control gate. Neighbors watched from the road. None of them understood why. One afternoon, Harold drove nearly 60 miles to a small family-owned fish hatchery outside Stuttgart, Arkansas. The owner, Ray Collins, had spent decades raising fingerlings for ponds across the delta. Harold walked into the office and placed a folded piece of paper on the counter. Ray looked at it, then looked back at Harold. "You serious?" "I've never been more serious." Ray smiled. "I haven't had an order like this in 20 years. The paper listed exactly what Harold wanted. 10,000 juvenile fish. Not for a pond. Not for recreation. For a rice field. Ray leaned back in his chair. "You know people are going to think you've lost your mind." Harold grinned. "They've thought that before." News traveled through Lonoke County faster than anyone expected. By Friday, farmers were discussing nothing except Harold Bennett's impossible plan. At Miller's feed store, coffee cups paused halfway to mouths. Fish in a rice field? He's finally gone crazy. Even people who respected Harold quietly shook their heads. Daniel Mercer heard the rumors while attending a county planning meeting. He couldn't believe them. The following Saturday morning, curiosity pulled nearly half the town toward the Bennett farm. Pickup trucks lined the gravel road. Children climbed fence rails. Older farmers removed their caps and squinted toward the empty field. A livestock truck slowly backed toward the irrigation canal. Water splashed against steel. Something alive moved inside. Daniel stepped forward. "What exactly are you doing?" Harold climbed down from the truck, giving the field what it has been missing. Daniel crossed his arms. "Fish don't fix dead soil." Several people laughed. One man slapped another on the shoulder. A woman covered her smile with her hand. Then Daniel laughed too, not cruelly, confidently. The laugh of a man certain science had already settled the argument. "So," Daniel said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "you're telling us 10,000 fish are going to grow rice?" The crowd burst into even louder laughter. Harold waited patiently until every voice faded. Then he answered in the same calm tone he had used his entire life. No, they're going to teach the field how to breathe again. No one understood. Not yet. Harold walked to the back of the truck. He slowly opened the first transport tank. Thousands of tiny silver fish shimmered beneath the water. For a brief moment, the entire crowd fell silent. Harold picked up the release hose. The first stream of water rushed into the irrigation canal. Tiny fish disappeared into the muddy current. Within minutes, thousands followed. Ripples spread across the shallow water. Dragonflies returned almost immediately. A blue heron circled overhead before landing at the edge of the field. Harold watched quietly. He wasn't watching the fish. He was watching the life returning around them. And for the first time in months, the dead rice field no longer looked dead. For the first week, nothing happened that anyone could measure. That was enough for most people to declare Harold Bennett's experiment a failure. The fish disappeared beneath the shallow water, flowing through the rebuilt rice levees. From the road, the field looked almost exactly the same as it had before. The cracked soil was hidden beneath only a few inches of irrigation water, and the young rice seedlings had not yet begun to emerge. Farmers driving past slowed down just long enough to shake their heads before continuing toward their own fields. At Miller's feed store, the conversations became even louder. 10,000 fish. I still can't believe he paid good money for that. My grandfather tried strange ideas, too. Yeah, another man laughed. But at least he wasn't stocking a rice field. The room erupted again. Daniel Mercer didn't join the laughter this time. He smiled politely, but something about the previous Saturday stayed with him. It wasn't Harold's words. It was the confidence behind them. Old farmers guessed. Harold seemed to know. That difference bothered Daniel more than he wanted to admit. 3 days later, he drove back to the Bennett farm. Harold was kneeling beside an irrigation gate, adjusting the water level with nothing more than a wooden measuring stick his father had carved decades earlier. "You've been checking this every morning?" Daniel asked. "And every evening." "Why?" "Because the fish need stable water. I thought this was about growing rice." Harold smiled. "It is." Daniel folded his arms. "I'm missing something." Harold stood slowly, brushed the mud from his knees, and pointed toward the water. "What do you see?" "Water. What else?" Daniel looked harder. "Nothing. I don't know." Harold nodded. "Exactly." He picked up a small net lying beside the canal and dipped it gently beneath the surface. When he lifted it, dozens of tiny creatures wriggled inside. Small insects, aquatic larvae, freshwater shrimp no larger than a fingernail. Daniel stared. "Those weren't here last week." "No, they followed the fish." Harold carefully released them back into the water. "They're rebuilding what we destroyed." Daniel remained silent. For the first time since earning his degree, he realized there was an entire living world beneath the surface of flooded rice field that no soil report had ever shown him. Let me tell you about flooded rice fields. Most people think they're simply fields covered with water. They're not. They're temporary ecosystems. When they're healthy, microscopic organisms feed insects. Insects feed small fish. Fish stir the mud with their movement, helping oxygen reach places where roots need it. Their waste returns nutrients to the water naturally. They also eat mosquito larvae and many pests that would otherwise damage young rice plants. Long before modern chemical programs became common, farmers across parts of Asia had quietly used fish and rice together for centuries because each helped the other survive. Harold hadn't invented anything new. He had simply remembered something old. Daniel looked across the flooded field again. "You knew this would happen." Harold shrugged. "I hoped." "That's different." "It is." The younger man smiled for the first time. "I've spent 10 years studying agriculture." Harold looked toward the horizon. "I've spent 50 studying this field." Neither man spoke for several minutes. The only sound came from frogs. Daniel noticed them immediately. There weren't frogs here before. No, they came back. So did the dragonflies. A red-winged blackbird landed on a fence post nearby. Then another. Within moments, half a dozen birds were searching the levees for insects. Life was returning. Quietly, almost invisibly, but unmistakably. News spread slowly at first. A neighboring farmer mentioned seeing birds he hadn't seen in years. Another noticed cleaner irrigation water leaving Harold's property than entering it. Someone else reported fewer mosquitoes around the flooded field. People dismissed each observation individually. Together, they formed a pattern. Daniel couldn't ignore it anymore. One evening, he returned carrying a notebook instead of a clipboard. "What are you writing?" Harold asked. "Everything I thought was impossible." Harold laughed softly. "That's a good place to start." As June warmed the Arkansas Delta, something even more surprising began happening beneath the shallow water. The rice seedlings that experts predicted would never recover started growing taller. Not dramatically, not overnight, just a little more each day. Enough that Harold noticed. Enough that Daniel measured. Enough that the county's most skeptical farmers began driving past more than once a week. They weren't laughing anymore. They were watching, because something was happening inside that field. Something none of their textbooks had prepared them to explain. Have you ever owned something that everyone else called worthless, only to discover it needed patience instead of replacement? Most people never get the chance to answer that question. Harold Bennett was living it, and within another 2 weeks, the entire county would gather at the edge of his rice field for a reason no one had expected. By the third week of June 1983, the difference could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Harold's rice field wasn't just surviving, it was changing. The pale yellow seedlings that had struggled through the first weeks of the season were now standing straighter than anyone expected. Their leaves carried a richer green color, and the water between the rows was alive with movement. Small fish darted through the flooded channels whenever sunlight reached the surface. Dragonflies skimmed low across the water. Frogs called from the levees long after sunset. The field sounded alive again. Daniel visited every other day. At first, he came to prove Harold wrong. Now he came because he couldn't explain what he was seeing. One afternoon, he knelt beside the water and carefully scooped a sample into a clear glass jar. Tiny organisms floated everywhere. The water wasn't dirty. It was healthy. Harold watched him smiling. "What do you think now?" Daniel looked up. "I think I spent years studying crops." He paused. "You spent years studying life." Harold nodded. "There's a difference." A week later, Daniel requested fresh soil samples. The laboratory results surprised everyone. Organic activity had increased. Beneficial microbial populations were returning. Natural nitrogen cycling showed measurable improvement. Even the soil structure had begun recovering where the fish constantly disturbed the muddy bottom. Daniel read the report 3 times before driving back to Harold's farm. This shouldn't be happening this quickly. Harold placed another handful of feed into the water. Nature works faster than people think. But every recommendation we made said this field was finished. The recommendations weren't wrong. Daniel looked confused. They just assumed the field had to stay the way it was. Those words stayed with Daniel long after he drove away. For the first time in his career, he realized that numbers only measure the present. Experience often recognizes the future. Let me tell you about that old John Deere 4020. Every morning before daylight, Harold climbed onto the faded vinyl seat with the same careful movement he had used for nearly 15 years. The diesel engine answered with its familiar rumble, never hesitating, never complaining. It pulled fertilizer tanks when needed, mowed the levees, repaired irrigation gates, and hauled fish feed from the storage barn to the field. People admired its reliability. Harold admired its honesty. "It doesn't pretend to be stronger than it is," he once told Daniel. "It simply does its job." Daniel laughed. "You sound like you're talking about yourself." Harold smiled. "Maybe I am." The younger man found himself laughing with him, not at him, with him. By early July, pickup trucks began parking along County Road 48 almost every evening. Farmers stood quietly beside the fence, staring across the flooded acres. Nobody joked anymore. Nobody called Harold crazy. Instead, they asked questions. "What kind of fish are those? How many did you release? How deep is the water?" Harold answered every question patiently. He never acted as though he had discovered a miracle, only a lesson. One afternoon, an older farmer named Carl Jenkins removed his cap before speaking. "I laughed at you." Harold nodded. "I remember. I shouldn't have." Harold shook his head gently. "We've all laughed at something we didn't understand." Daniel heard the exchange from only a few feet away. It reminded him of his own words outside Bennett's feed store weeks earlier. He had laughed, too, not because he wanted to hurt Harold, because certainty had blinded curiosity. That evening, Daniel drove home without turning on the radio. He thought about every recommendation he had given struggling farmers since taking the job. How many times had he advised replacing something instead of restoring it? How many fields had been abandoned before anyone tried rebuilding the life beneath them? The questions were uncomfortable, but they were necessary. Late one afternoon, dark clouds gathered over eastern Arkansas. Within an hour, heavy rain began falling across Lono County. The storm dumped nearly 4 inches overnight. Neighboring fields overflowed. Freshly planted sections washed out. Drainage ditches filled to their banks. Several farmers worried that Harold's experiment had finally reached its end. Daniel rushed the farm before sunrise. He expected disaster. Instead, he found Harold standing beside the flooded field, calmly watching the water move through the levees exactly as planned. The rebuilt channels guided the excess water smoothly from one section to another. The fish swam freely. The young rice bent with the current, but never uprooted. Nothing had failed. Daniel looked across the field in disbelief. "You planned for this?" Harold nodded. "My father always said you don't prepare for sunshine." He smiled. "You prepare for the storm." Daniel stood beside him in silence. For the first time since arriving in Lono County, he understood why older farmers respected quiet experience more than loud confidence, because experience had already survived the storms that confidence had only read about. As the rain clouds drifted east, sunlight broke through the morning sky. Thousands of tiny ripples shimmered across the flooded field. The fish were feeding. The rice was growing. And somewhere deep inside, Daniel Mercer realized the biggest transformation wasn't happening beneath the water. It was happening inside him. Yet neither man knew that within a month, the county's annual rice yield inspection would bring dozens of officials to the Bennett farm. And one measurement, taken with a simple harvest scale, would leave every one of them speechless. By the first week of August 1983, word had traveled far beyond Lono County. Farmers from Prairie County, Arkansas County, and even parts of Mississippi County drove for hours just to stand beside Harold Bennett's rice field. They expected to see some secret machine or an expensive irrigation system hidden behind the trees. Instead, they found an old man wearing faded overalls, a 40-acre field humming with life, and a weathered John Deere 4020 parked beneath a cottonwood tree with dried mud still clinging to its tires. Nothing about the farm looked extraordinary. Everything about the results did. The county scheduled its annual crop inspection for August 11th, 1983. Representatives from the Agriculture Extension Office arrived shortly after sunrise carrying notebooks, moisture meters, plant samples, and yield records from neighboring farms. Daniel Mercer walked beside them, no longer as a confident expert leading the inspection, but as someone eager to learn what the numbers would reveal. Harold greeted every visitor with the same quiet smile. No speeches, no celebration, just a handshake. One inspector knelt beside a row of rice and gently pulled a plant from the soil. He frowned. Then he called another inspector over. Within minutes, 4 men were crouched in the mud studying the root system. One of them looked up. "I've never seen roots this healthy in a field that was written off 3 months ago." Another sliced open a handful of soil with a pocket knife. It crumbled instead of breaking apart. Earthworms, tiny aquatic insects, healthy organic matter. Everything the April report claimed was disappearing had begun returning. Daniel watched silently. He remembered reading those same reports. Back then they described a dying field. Now they described a recovering ecosystem. There was only one difference: 10,000 fish. Let me tell you about something most people misunderstand. People often believe healthy farming is about forcing crops to grow. It isn't. The best farmers understand that crops are only one part of a much larger system. Healthy soil feeds roots. Healthy water feeds soil. Fish stir nutrients that would otherwise settle uselessly into the mud. Birds reduce insects. Frogs eat pests. Earthworms loosen compacted ground. Every living thing performs a job, and when enough of those jobs happen naturally, the farmer spends less time fighting nature and more time working alongside it. Harold had never declared war on his field. He had invited it back to life. The inspection continued through the afternoon. Plant height exceeded expectations. Disease pressure remained unusually low. Insect damage measured far below nearby fields. Even more surprising, Harold had used significantly less chemical pesticide than neighboring farms. One official quietly whispered to another, "This doesn't make sense." Harold overheard him. "It doesn't," he replied, "unless you're measuring the wrong thing." The official looked puzzled. "We've been measuring rice." Harold pointed toward the water, where hundreds of small fish flashed beneath the afternoon sun. "I've been measuring life." For a long moment, nobody spoke. Daniel smiled. A few months earlier, those words would have sounded foolish. Now they sounded undeniable. Later that afternoon, several neighboring farmers gathered beneath the equipment shed while Harold serviced the John Deere 4020. He removed the engine cover with practiced hands, changed the oil filter, checked every grease fitting, adjusted a loose hydraulic hose. One younger farmer finally asked a question everyone had been wondering. "Mr. Bennett." Harold looked up. "Why keep fixing this old tractor? You could buy something newer." Harold wiped his hands with a shop rag. "This tractor has never left me stranded. But modern tractors have more horsepower." Harold nodded. "They do. They're faster. They are. So why keep this one?" Harold rested one hand on the faded green hood. "Because reliability is remembered longer than speed." Daniel looked at the old machine differently after hearing those words. The tractor wasn't valuable because it was old. It was valuable because someone had cared for it long enough to make old mean dependable. As the inspection teams prepared to leave, the county supervisor approached Harold with an unusual request. "We're holding the annual rice producers meeting next Friday." Harold waited politely. "We'd like you to explain what you've done here." Harold looked across the field before answering. "I'll come." The supervisor smiled with relief. "Good. People need to hear this." Harold shook his head gently. "No." The supervisor frowned. "They need to see it." Daniel couldn't help smiling. He already knew that Harold's greatest lessons were never spoken from a stage. They were lived in a field. The Lonoke County Rice Producers meeting drew its largest crowd in years. On the morning of August 19th, 1983, more than 100 farmers, equipment dealers, agricultural lenders, county officials, and university representatives gathered on folding chairs beneath a large canvas tent overlooking Harold Bennett's rice field. Pickup trucks lined both sides of County Road 48 for nearly half a mile. Some people had driven from as far away as Greene County after hearing rumors about an old farmer who had supposedly restored exhausted soil with fish instead of chemicals. Most arrived skeptical. They left differently. Daniel Mercer stood near the front of the crowd, holding the same notebook he had carried since the first fish entered the field. It was nearly full now, not with theories from textbooks, but with observations made beside Harold's levees. The county supervisor stepped forward. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "many of us believe this field was beyond recovery. Today we're here because Mr. Harold Bennett proved there was another possibility." Applause spread politely through the crowd. Harold removed his cap. He waited until the applause stopped. Then he spoke. "I don't have a speech." The crowd smiled. "I've never been good at speeches." A few people laughed softly. Harold turned toward the flooded field. "If you really want to understand what happened here," he pointed toward the water, "come walk with me." Within minutes, the entire crowd left their chairs behind. They followed Harold along the narrow levees, stopping every few hundred feet while he knelt to show them insects beneath floating plants, fish swimming between rice rows, earthworms in the softened soil, and healthy roots stretching deeper than anyone expected. He never claimed to have discovered something revolutionary. He simply explained what he had observed over a lifetime. When the field is healthy, he said, the farmer doesn't have to do every job himself. Daniel watched experience growers nodding in agreement. These weren't people easily impressed. They had spent decades judging ideas by results instead of promises. One older farmer finally spoke. "My grandfather used to say almost the same thing." Harold smiled. "Mine did, too." The crowd continued walking until they reached the center of the field. The difference was impossible to ignore. Healthy green rice stretched in every direction. Fish disturbed the water with small splashes. Birds circled overhead before settling among the levees. What had looked lifeless only months earlier now sounded like a living wetland. Daniel stepped forward unexpectedly. "I owe everyone here an apology." The crowd turned toward him, especially Harold. Daniel took a slow breath. "The first time I visited this farm, I believe my reports told the whole story." He looked directly at Harold. I laughed. His voice grew quieter. "I laughed because I confused education with understanding." Silence settled over the field. "I told Mr. Bennett to abandon this land." He paused again. "I was wrong." No one interrupted. "I thought I came here to teach an old farmer." Daniel smiled. "It turns out an old farmer taught me." Harold walked over and extended his hand. Daniel shook it firmly. The applause that followed lasted far longer than the first. This time it wasn't polite. It was earned. A week later, the combines entered the Bennett farm. Harold's John Deere 4020 wasn't harvesting the rice itself, but pulled grain wagons exactly as it had for years, moving steadily from field to storage bins without missing a beat. Everyone wanted to know a number. Yield. County officials supervised the measurements personally. Each wagon was weighed. Moisture levels were recorded. Harvest losses were calculated. No one wanted rumors. They wanted facts. When the final figures were added together, even the inspectors checked the math twice. The field everyone had declared economically dead had produced a harvest well above the county average. Not the highest. Not a miracle. Something better. Proof. Proof that restoration could outperform surrender. Reporters from a regional agricultural newspaper arrived 2 days later. One asked Harold for the secret. "There isn't one." Another asked whether fish alone deserved the credit. Harold shook his head. "No, the fish helped. The water helped. The soil helped. The birds helped. I simply stopped getting in their way." The reporter lowered his notebook. "That's your headline?" Harold laughed softly. "No, that's just farming." As autumn sailed across eastern Arkansas, neighboring farms quietly began experimenting with small test plots of their own. Not because Harold told them to, because results speak more clearly than arguments. Daniel helped organize workshops explaining integrated rice and fish farming. Every presentation began the same way. He held up the original soil report declaring Harold's field beyond recovery. Then he held up the harvest report from August. "Never forget," he told every audience, "that today's impossible idea may become tomorrow's common practice." One evening after harvest, Daniel stopped beside Harold's equipment shed. The old John Deere sat cooling after another day's work. "You know," Daniel said, "people are starting to call this the Bennett method." Harold smiled. "They can call it whatever they like." Daniel laughed. "What do you call it?" Harold looked across the quiet field, glowing beneath the setting sun. "I call it listening." Daniel followed his gaze. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The field was alive. The tractor was still working. The fish were still swimming. Everything seemed exactly as it should be, until a letter arrived from Little Rock bearing the seal of the Arkansas Department of Agriculture, a letter that would place Harold Bennett's quiet experiment before the entire state and test whether his greatest lesson could survive far beyond the boundaries of one remarkable rice field. The letter arrived on September 12, 1983, folded neatly inside an official envelope bearing the seal of the Arkansas Department of Agriculture. Harold Bennett opened it slowly while sitting at the same kitchen table where his father had once balanced crop ledgers with a stub of a pencil. The invitation was simple. The department wanted Harold to demonstrate his methods before county extension agents, university researchers, and rice producers from across the state during the annual agricultural conference in Stuttgart, Arkansas. Harold read the letter twice. Then he folded it carefully. His daughter smiled. "Are you going?" Harold looked out the window toward the rice field. I'm taking the field with me. A month later, more than 300 people gathered for the demonstration. Most expected charts. Some expected complicated scientific presentations. Instead, Harold placed three things on a wooden table: a glass jar filled with healthy field water, a handful of rich black soil, and an old photograph of his father standing beside the farm in 1948. The audience looked confused. Harold picked up the photograph. "My father taught me that every field is borrowed from the next generation." He placed it back on the table. Then he lifted the jar. "This water is invaluable because it's wet." He held up the soil. "And this soil is invaluable because it's dirt." He smiled. "They're valuable because they're alive." The room became perfectly still. Researchers who had spent careers studying production systems found themselves listening to a man who had never published a paper. Yet everything he said matched what many of them had begun observing in sustainable farming research. After the presentation, questions continued for nearly 2 hours. How many fish should be stocked? How deep should the water remain? Would the system work every year? Harold answered honestly. Sometimes he simply said, "I don't know." Daniel Mercer stood nearby, watching people gather around the old farmer who had once been laughed out of a feed store. Months earlier, Daniel would have answered every question himself. Now, he understood something more important. Good farmers never stop learning. Neither should good teachers. Over the next 5 years, dozens of Arkansas growers experimented with integrating fish into portions of their rice operations. Some succeeded immediately. Others failed because they rushed the process or ignored water management. Harold never criticized them. Whenever someone asked why their first attempt hadn't worked, he always smiled. You can't copy patience. Daniel eventually became one of the state's strongest advocates for soil restoration rather than soil replacement. He rewrote county recommendations. He encouraged biological monitoring alongside chemical analysis. Whenever young extension agents joined the office, he told them the story of the old farmer who changed his career without ever raising his voice. He always ended the lesson the same way. Never mistake confidence for wisdom. Let me tell you about the John Deere 4021 last time. By the early 1990s, newer tractors with enclosed cabs, electronic controls, and greater horsepower filled farms across Arkansas. Dealers repeatedly offered Harold generous trade-in values. He politely refused every time. The tractor had now logged more than 11,000 working hours. Its engine had been rebuilt once. The clutch replaced twice. The original transmission remained untouched. Every winter, Harold serviced it exactly as he always had. Fresh oil, fresh grease, fresh respect. He often said machines lasted longer when people stopped treating maintenance as an expense. The old Deere never became a museum piece. It remained exactly what it had always been, a working tractor. Harold Bennett continued farming well into his 80s. He harvested one final rice crop in 1994 before handing daily operations to his daughter, Emily Bennett, and his grandson, Thomas, named after the man who first bought the farm more than 50 years earlier. They kept the fish. They kept the levees. They kept the old tractor. Most importantly, they kept listening to the land. Harold passed away peacefully during the winter of 1998, surrounded by family. At his request, there was no display of expensive flowers. Instead, neighbors gathered in the machine shed after service. Someone rested a weathered work glove on the hood of the John Deere 4020. No one spoke for several minutes. They didn't need to. The tractor, still stained with Arkansas mud, had become something more than steel. It had become memory. Years later, Daniel Mercer returned to the Bennett farm with a group of university students. The rice fields shimmered beneath the summer sun. Fish still moved through the water. The same John Deere 4020 idled near the barn before heading out to mow the levees. One student asked Daniel, "Did this really happen?" Daniel smiled. "It happened." People laughed. They did. And one farmer changed everyone's mind. Daniel looked across the field. No, he changed it one season, one conversation, and one example at a time. The student wrote those words down. Daniel hoped he never forgot them. Today, visitors driving along that quiet Arkansas road still notice something different about the Bennett farm. Birds gather their first each spring. Frogs return before sunset. The irrigation water runs clear. And every harvest season, the old John Deere still rumbles across the levees, driven now by Harold's grandson, who rests his hand on the faded green hood before turning the key, just as his grandfather always did. Some traditions survive because people refuse to let them disappear. Others survive because they continue proving they still work. Some fields don't die because they grow old. They die only when people stop believing life can return. And sometimes all it takes is the courage to release 10,000 fish where everyone else saw only failure. If Harold Bennett's story reminded you of someone who quietly proved everyone wrong, not with arguments, but with patience and hard work, I would love to hear about them in the comments. Have you ever restored something that others believed was beyond saving, whether it was a farm, an old machine, or even a dream? Share your story below. I read every comment. And if you'd like to hear the remarkable story of the Iowa farmer who saved his family's harvest with a forgotten 1949 Oliver 88 after every modern tractor failed, I think you'll enjoy what's coming next.